Hello and welcome to this beginner to intermediate course on unit testing with Jest. What is software testing and why do we need test? Software testing is simply the process of evaluating and confirming that our application does what it is supposed to do. Why do we need test? We need tests in order to prevent bugs. So we want to be able to catch bugs on time. In order to also improve performance, we need tests in order to reduce development costs, to improve reliability and our customer satisfaction. What are the types of tests we have? We have what we call the unit test, which actually involve testing individual units of our code. For instance, function, methods, and many more. Also, we have integration test, which combines different units. We also have end-to-end test, which involves replicating our end user behavior. But for this course, we are going to be focusing on unit testing using Jest. So the question is, what is Jest? Jest is simply a JavaScript framework. It works with projects using Typescript, Node, Angular, and many more. It is the most popular and most supported testing framework. It is all-in-one solution because it is a test runner and also an assertion library that gives us powerful set of matchers. We are going to be seeing all these matchers very soon. Up with this course, we need just two things. First, we need Node.js installed. So if you don't have Node.js installed on your PC, you can simply come to nodejs.org and install Node on your system. The second thing we need is a text editor. For this course, I will be using Visual Studio Code. So feel free to use any coding editor of your choice. Alright guys, let's just go straight to the point. So first, let's create an empty folder. And I'm going to name this unit testing. You can name it anything you want. Good. So if you're on Windows, just click on this folder, right click on this folder and open it with your text editor. But if you're on Mac, you can simply drag and drop this folder. Good. Now we have everything we need in order to start. The first step is to initialize a node project, and we do this by simply running npm init. I'm going to add the flag wise so we don't waste our time answering some questions. Good. Now we have our package.json file. Next, we need to add all the dependencies we need in order to use Jest. First, let's just enter npm install. You can type install or simply use npm i -d because all the dependencies we need, they are all development dependencies. So -d, we need Jest. We need Typescript because we are going to be using Typescript in this project. We need TS-Jest to help Jest understand our Typescript code. For now, we also need the types, so let's add our types /Jest. Perfect. So you hit enter. This might take some time. Right. So now you see def dependencies, and then we have everything we entered. Good. We can close this for now. We don't need it. So the next thing we need to do is to configure a file so that Jest can actually know where to look for our source code. So we want to configure a file, and we can do this either by using the command line or doing it manually. To use the command line, since you have this, you have tsjest, so we can simply say nps tsjest config init. So what this does is actually it creates jest.config.js. But remember, we want to use Typescript. So because of this, I'm going to simply delete this file since I'm not using JavaScript. And let's just manually add this file. And we saw that it is simply jest.config.ts. Perfect. So first, we are going to import all we need. We need the config object. And we are importing this from at jest/types. Perfect. So now let's just name it config and is of type config. This particular config, and this particular config is an object with a lot of stuff. But here we need the initial options, and we are going to equate this to an object. All right, so let's set our preset, and our preset is going to be our tsjest, and this is simply to let Jest understand our TypeScript code. Also, we need to define the test environment we are using, which is obviously Node. Finally, let's add variables. And let's say this is true. And this will actually give us more information when we run our test. Finally, we are exporting this config object from this file. And then let's save it. All right. We are done with this for now. We can just close it. The next thing we want to do is actually to create our folder structure. So let's create a simple folder. Let's name it src, and in this folder, let's just follow the standard. So inside this folder, we are going to make everything organized. Let's create a folder for our application, and then let's create another folder still inside src, create another folder for our test. Perfect. So in the app folder, let's add a simple file, and let's name it basic utils.ts. And here, let's just simply export a function that returns the product of two numbers. So let's just call it product, and it's going to take two numbers. So for now, let's just say a, and that a is a type number, so that we will not be passing string later. And also b, which is of type number, and we know that this function is going to be returning the product of a and b. So simply we can also tell the return type, which is number. All right. So here we must return a multiplied by b. And already we are exporting this function. So we can simply go and actually write a test for this particular function. Okay, so let's add another file, and let's name it basic utils, which is the same name. The only difference is here we are going to use spec. Instead of spec, you can also use test, but I'm going to be using spec.ts. Perfect. Now we have access to our describe function. Let's simply write basic utils test suite, because this is going to contain lots of suite. Okay, and this is going to also takes the description of what we want to do as string, and also is going to take a function. So here let's use the arrow function, and now let's write our test. Here you can use test like this, or you use it. So I'm going to be using it, and here is just returns, let's say 3 and 2. Perfect. Also, this also takes a function. And now we can write, let's define a constant and let's call it our actual, which is equal to product. So our actual is actually this particular function. This is the system under test. This is what we want to test. So here we are trying to bring in this product. If you look carefully, you will see that this product is coming from a step outside. Then we go to this app and then we have our basic utils. I hope you get this, guys. All right. So product is a function we have here and it takes two numbers. And you see, you must have the import. Please, if this is not done automatically for you, just manually import this file. And here we want to pass 3 and 2. All right. So we can just write our first simple test, which is expect our actual dot. So this expect returns an expectation, which most of the time all we will be doing is to run some matchers on this expectation. So for now, let's use to be. So in this case, to be is the matcher. And to be actually uses object.is, to actually test exact equality. This is important. All right, so we expect this to be 6. Let's save this, guys. And now we can run our test. We can just start running our test. It's as simple as this. But to run this test, we must come to our package.json under scripts. If you don't have your script, just come to this place and manually add it. But I already have it. I don't need to do that. So under script, you see this test. Here you can just put Jest and then save it. So now we can run our test. But I'm sure we are going to have one problem. Let's see what happens. npm, just npm test. Good. And then we have this nice error. And this is telling us that failed to pass the TypeScript config file. And it's even telling us the solution. Jest needs TS node. You see, TS node is required for the TypeScript configuration files. So to actually clear this error, all we need to do is to add one more thing to our def dependencies, which is the TS node. So here we can just clear this and we can simply run npm I. It should be under dev dependencies and we need the TS node. Perfect. Great. You see, now we have our TS node. We shouldn't get this same error again. So now you can simply run npm test and you see nice. Our test is passing, but there is also a warning. You see, if you have an issue related to import, you should consider setting ES module interrupt. This is so lovely because we are getting help. We are getting the right solution. All right. So the only thing we need to do now is to add a TS config file. So let's just create TS config.json file. We saw that we should add our compiler option. So you see here, let's add this compiler options, and it's going to be our, from here, I'm just using what I'm looking at. So this is ES module interrupt and set this to true. When you save this file and run this test again, npm test, we should not get this same error again. You see, our test is working, and congratulations, this is our first simple setup, our first simple test, and this particular setup is actually valid and correct. You can see that all we did is just like a very simple thing. All we did was to just check for the product of two numbers. Now let's also do some other things here. Here we used to be. We also have many other matchers. So let's just continue from here and then we can proceed to more advanced stuff. So here we can also expect our actual dot. So we've used to be. For numbers, to be and to equal, we also have to equal. They're equivalent to each other. So either you use to be or you use to equal, it is doing the same thing for numbers. All right, especially for whole numbers like this, because when you have decimal, there is another better matcher to check what exactly you want to do. So we can also run this test and you are going to see that it's going to pass. We can also check that expect our actual dot. We also have to be less than or greater than. To be less than, of course, we expect this to be less than 8 and this should be correct. And you see this is correct. But when you say 6 to be less than 4, it's going to give us an error. You see, an error. But we can say to be less than, of course, 9. That should be correct. We also have expect. We also have dot to be greater than or equal to. We have a lot of matchers. So this 6 should be greater than, let's say, 5. And this should be correct. So you can run this test. And this is correct. All right, guys, before we move on, I'm going to show you some things in the documentation. It is very important to actually know how to use this documentation. So this is Jest documentation. If you come to docs and under docs, you see getting started. So here it tells us a lot of things about how you can start using Jest, the configuration, initialization, and all the stuff we did. And also we have the matchers. For instance, you've seen to be equal to be less than. We have a lot of matchers. And then we see some matchers for numbers. We see some, this is numbers. So you can come to the documentation. This is very important, guys. If you want to understand things more than you see in any YouTube video, it is important to know how to read documentation, because as developers, you are problem solvers. You must be able to know how to look out for solutions to your problem. So the documentation is very important. All right, so let's go back to our code. All right. And now, guys, if you look at this test is difficult to understand. It has a lot of things. This is not a good way to write your test, because a good test should actually follow some structure. So let's look at the structure of a properly written unit test. A well-written unit test should undergo 3 different phases, which are the AAA phases. The first one is arrange, which is initialize a small piece of an application, that is, initialize the system under test. And the second one is to act. So we can apply some stimuli, we can apply some methods. And the third one is to assert. So we are going to be using these 3A structures, these AAA phases. Let's change what we did here in order to use the AAA phases. The first thing is to arrange. So we can say const suit is equal to product. Perfect. And const actual is equal to product. So our product now is our suit, and then we can pass 3 into. We can remove this. and this also should work. So here we are arranging, here we are acting, which is the second A, and now asserting. So let's run this test and see what happens. And you see everything works. But guys, let's look at this test again. A properly written unit test must be written in such a way that anyone can understand your test. For instance, if anything should break in this code, it's difficult to find the error, especially when you are testing for a lot of things. To prove this, let's add another method. So here, let's export a function. So basically, it's going to be a function that checks for user authentication, or let's call it authenticate user. And this function is going to take in two things. So it needs a username, which is of type string, and also password, which is of type string. And of course, this let's do this thing correctly. So here I'm going to add another file, and I'm going to call it our auth data.ts. So here, let's export an interface. All right. So inside this particular interface, let's add some stuff. So let's say username to lowercase. So we want to get our username, and we are going to change it to the lowercase, and this is going to give us string. All right, so let's also have the username characters, and this is going to be array of string, which is also the same thing as writing string array. So anyone you want, you can either write it like this or you write it like this. Array of string. Perfect. So we also want to get our user details, and this is going to just be of type object or maybe undefined. Also, we want to check is authenticated, and this is going to be simply Boolean. All right, already we are exporting this, so we can go back to this, and now we know that this particular function should return a type of our auth data, this particular one coming from dot. So you have the import here, and now we must return something. But before we return an object of this particular auth data form, let's create a constant and let's fake user authentication. So let's check auth status is equal to, let's say we want to check username equal developer, and the password is the same thing as dev. This auth status is going to return true if the entered username is equal to this and the password is the same thing as this. So these two things must be correct because we are using this end here. So for us to avoid this error, let's just simply return an object, and we already know what to return. We are returning an object of this format. So here we must pass everything we add in this file. So we have the username to lower everything, these four stuffs. So here we are returning, and we are also getting some help. Username to lower, which is actually, we take the username, which is the entered username, and then let's make it dot to lowercase, which is the inbuilt string function. Also, we need the username characters. and this should be username dot split because we want the characters, and then we are going to split by this. And next we need our user details. Let's just simply pass an empty object for now. And finally we need is authenticated, and this is going to be our auth status. So is either going to be true when this is the same or false when it is otherwise. So this is going to be our auth status. And now we are done. So guys, now we have two functions here. We have this and this. We've seen how we can simply test for this. Let's see what happens for this. So let's go back to our test. And still inside this describe, I'm going to add another it function. And now we can also arrange. So let's follow the same format. So our actually is equal to, so the name of our function is authenticate user, and authenticate user is going to take two things, but I'm not doing that here because the next thing now is to define our actual, which is going to be suit. And now suit is going to take in two things, which is the username and the password, and both of them are strings. So I'm going to pass the same developer, and the other one, let's also pass this. And now we can start our test. So expect. Now we are going to see the difference between testing just simple, the product of two numbers, and when you have a function that returns an object, because our authenticate user function actually returns an object, items inside this object. So first we have dot to lowercase. So actual dot to lowercase, here we can use to be. So we are saying that the username, remember, go back to this. Here we said username dot to lowercase. So that means here we are expecting the username to be developer. Everything in lowercase. Perfect. So let's test this and see if it works or not. Alright, so now we have two passed tests. The first one is for this it function. So you see that every it block has its own test. So you see, and the second one is for the second it, which is user authentication, and the two tests are passing. So the next thing we want to do, we want to expect actual dot. So we want to check for characters. Good. Now these characters, when you use dot split on any string, remember it returns an array. So how do we test for array? So we can add a comment here. Remember that a string is a primitive type, but an array is a reference type. So if you do dot to b, and here you pass in your array. All right, so we have this particular array. This is what we are expecting, because this is actually what we are passing here. DEVE developer. Perfect. So if you run this test, it's going to fail. It's going to fail because this to be actually uses object.is, does exact comparison. So this to be only works with primitive type. So when you are working with reference type, this to be is not going to work. To prove this, if you run this test, it's going to fail. Perfect. So you see, we pass one and we fail one. Which one are we failing? User authentication, because of this particular to be. So to actually test for arrays or objects, you have to use another matcher called to equal. When you save this and then you run this test again, it's going to pass now. Perfect, guys. All right, we can also check, instead of using to equal, you can also check if a particular item is inside this array. So we can also check to contain. We also have this to contain matcher. So to contain what? Let's say if it contains R or not. All right, let's run this test and see what happens. Simple, it is passing. But guys, let's see what happens when we add F, because we don't have F in developer. This should fail. Perfect, you see. So you have several matches, guys. You can go to the documentation and look at this. There is another thing we should check when we are actually using these matches. But before we do that, guys, let's look at something. So I can add E here again. Look at this test. It is becoming so much. And what happens in this case when there is a problem, to actually figure what exactly the problem is difficult from here. Because here we only have user authentication. Does it mean that everything here is failing? No. Particular one, this expect block was also correct. The only one that we had issues with was when we added a letter that is not part of developer. But now everything in this particular it block, you can add to only, we only run this particular block. So let's run this test again. Now it's going to pass because we have E, which is part of developer. Let's add W and let's run this test again, npm test. You see, everything fails, but this is not supposed to be. So your unit test should be well written. It should be well organized. This is where the first principle enters. So to write a good unit test, we should apply the first U principle. F stands for fast. Your unit test should be fast. It should be independent. So your unit test should not depend on other test cases. It should be repeatable. That is, whenever you run your unit test, you should get the same results. It should be self-validating. Unit tests should determine if the actual output is according to the expected. There shouldn't be any manual interpretation to your test. It should be timely. You can actually write your test anytime. You can decide to complete your application before running your test. It depends on you. But it is a good idea to follow the test-driven development. So the TDD approach is a very good practice. And your unit test should be clear and easy to understand. Alright guys, we saw that we are actually not doing this thing the way it should be done, because we have seen that our unit test should be easy to understand. We should be able to easily figure out what exactly is the problem whenever there is an error. So we can actually rewrite everything we've done here. So instead of using this particular it block, we can just use describe. We can have another describe block inside this describe. So we have our main describe block. I am adding another describe block and I'm going to call it. We also need to pass a function, just like what we did before. And now I'm going to have my it. But now I'm going to have this it block for everything we are testing. So here we tested for lowercase, here we tested for the characters. So for the lowercase, we are going to have the it block. For the characters, we are going to have the it block. For everything we are going to test, we are going to write everything small, just everything is going to be on its own. And then we are going to see the difference here in this particular terminal. Whenever we run the test, we are going to see what happens. So it And here I am testing for lowercase, so it should return. All right. And also we pass our function just as before. And now we can just say const and const actual is equal to this. So we can just copy this. All right. And now we can just test for our lowercase. Perfect. So we have this it block for to lowercase. So let's add another it block. We can simply copy this and we paste it here. So instead of returning lowercase of a valid user, we want to return the username characters. And here, instead of dot to lower, is going to be dot username characters. Guys, remember that we saw previously that we cannot use to be for a reference type. So this is an array. The username character is an array. So we cannot use to be. We can simply use to equal. Now I'm going to show you another thing we can test with the characters. Like when working with an array, what happens if, okay, so dot to equal. Wait, let's complete this and I'm going to tell you what I want to say. All right, so here we are going to pass this particular array. So let's just copy it in order not to waste our time. And we paste this. All right, so expect actual.user characters to equal this. This is a correct test. But guys, what happens if, okay, first, let's run this test and I'm going to ask a question. What happens if we don't know the format in which the user is going to enter? Of course, we are expecting developer. But what if we are expecting array containing DEVEL? What if these letters are not arranged? How do we actually confirm that all these letters are the same thing as what the user entered? So let's run this test, and of course I think this should pass. npm test. All right, this is failing because down here we have W. So for now we can actually remove this block since we don't need it, and let's save it. We can also remove this comment and let's run our test again. And now we see, so we are skipping each block. We are running only this block. So when you use dot only is actually one of the test, one of the properties. So when you use dot only, it's going to run only this particular block. But now we want to run this particular describe. So you can use only on describe, you can use it on it. So we can say describe dot only. And let's save this and run this test again. So now we should see something very important, because now you see we have our authentication test suite, which is this, and we have this second one and also this second one. So inside this describe for now, we have only two it function, this particular one and this one. And now you see everything we are doing is becoming more clear. Let's continue, guys. Now, the other time I said, what if the user entered developer but not well arranged? So we can also, let's use another it block. So we can simply copy this particular it block, and now let's paste it here. So instead of entering this thing this way, I'm going to remove this and I'm going to enter it here, and let's save this. So now let's run this test and see what happens. So instead of writing it this way, I am writing it this way. Lopa dev. Okay, let's run this test and see what happens. So this fails. You see, expect, we see what we are expecting and what we are getting. And this failed because we cannot write this like this because this is not well organized. So since instead of using dot to equal just directly like this, here we can also pass expect dot, we can use array containing, so array containing this. And let's save this and run this test again. So what happens? We are checking that this is equal to an array containing this particular stuff. So even when the letters are not organized, I think this test should pass. Perfect. Now you see everything is passing, and we also have an additional line here. So next, guys, I think we also check, you can also check when a particular letter is in an array, which we did previously using array.contain. So now I'm going to remove this block. We don't need it again because now we are writing our test in a good way. So next, I'm going to add another it block. Still, we can just copy and paste instead of repeating ourselves. And here we are not testing for this. We can remove all this. So here we want to test actual dot. We also have this user details, which is an object. So, okay. So dot, if you use to be, remember, an object is a reference type. It is not primitive. I already told you that to be is used for primitive. So when you run this test, this particular block should fail. And it is failing. And you also see that it is telling us what exactly the problem is with this red mark here. And now when the test fails, guys, remember initially when we have any part of our test failing, everything fails. But now the only part that fails is the part where there is an error. And that is why it is good to organize your test very well. So you use each block for each of the stuff you want to test. All right, so here we cannot use to be, we can use to equal, which will be correct. So now when you run this test, this should be correct. Perfect. Now there is another matcher we can use on objects. We have lots of matchers, guys, lots. Just check through the documentation. So instead of to equal, we can also check to be defined. We also have another matcher. Okay, let's check this. Let's run the test. And perfect, it is working. We can also just simply here, I want to show you many other matchers you can use on objects. User details dot. Now we have to be defined. We also have to be undefined. So I can say to be undefined. And if I want to check the opposite of this undefined, the opposite should be defined, right? So here, if I want to check for the opposite, you simply use not. Dot not to be undefined. When you save this also should work. We also have dot to be truthy, to be falsy, to be, we have a lot of matches, guys. You need to go through the documentation. So actual dot user details dot to be truthy, all right, and this also should work. We also have the opposite of to be truthy, which is to be not to be falsy. We have to be falsy when you want to check if something is falsy. So it depends on whatsoever you are doing. I'm just trying to show you that we have lots of these beautiful matches. User details dot not dot to be falsy. Perfect. And this also should work. We also have a boolean. Let's also copy this, and we can remove this part. We don't need it. So we expect, let's write our assertion, expect actual dot user details. Now let's check for this is authenticated, which is a boolean. So remember, if here we have dev, so we can use to be truthy or not to be falsy. So if we use to be truthy, because we are expecting true, so to be truthy, this should pass. So let's run this. And to be truthy, let's remember to change this. So here we are testing that it should return. All right, now what happens if I want to run the opposite of this? Remember, we can also use dot not to be falsy. I've shown you this before. All right, let's look at the next aspect. If you look at everything we did here, you should simply see that we are repeating ourselves a lot. Here I have constitute, actual. In each of these it block, we are repeating ourselves with these two lines. One thing that could come to our mind is, why not copy these two lines, move it up to the main describe? So we have this describe. Why not move them here and then just use them wherever we need them? If we do this, it becomes a bad practice, because our test, as we see from the first principle, our test should be independent. So we cannot do this. Instead, we are going to use Jest hook to actually help us from not repeating ourselves. So Jest provides us with some hooks that we can use in order not to repeat ourselves. In order to actually look into this Jest hook, yet I'm going to add another thing in this particular file. So let's check for how can we actually test for a class. So we've tested function. Let's move a step higher. So let's export a class. Inside this class, let's just add a method and let's call it a public, or we can just call this to lowercase. Save. But I don't just want to do this. I only want to do this if the user actually enter the username. Like if there is a username, then this should happen. So instead of doing this, I'm going to check if username is not equal to an, or preferable, we can say if username is equal to an empty string, it should just do what? It should just throw. Okay, let's save this. And now we want to actually test for this class. So in order to test for this class, let's go back to our test file and let's just leave these particular blocks this way. So here I add a describe for this. So let me remove this only. And now I'm going to add yet another describe block. So we say describe also takes a function, and inside this function, now we want to look at some Jest hooks. So Jest actually gives us some nice hooks that we can use in order to avoid all this repetition we did above. So let's look at the first one, which in other words we can call it setup. So let's do some setup here. Describe, I can let suit be of type. What is the name of this class? Username to lowercase, be of type username to lowercase, and then we see it here, username to lowercase. Perfect. So now I am going to call the first hook, which is called before it takes a function. And then what should happen before each? Here, let's console.log. And here, so I'm going to say that my suit is equal to, so let's create an instance of this class. So that should be new user. Let's correct this. This is a class. It should start with a capital letter. And let's correct this. A capital letter. Big face. Okay. And we can remove this import. Alright, your class should start with a capital letter and not with lowercase. So it should be new user name to lowercase. What we are saying here is that before our it block, this particular function will run. So this is the first thing that is going to run. And now we can add our it blocks. So now we can say it return username, and we pass a function. Okay, so let's pass a function. Inside here now we can just say const actual is equal to suit dot to lower, and let's just pass in Bob. So expect actual dot. All right, guys, but before this assertion, let's console.log test. Perfect. So let's check for this. And also we also have after each, and this takes also a function, and let's just console here, save, and let's see what happens. Npm test. Okay, so we have our authentication test suite. No, we are looking at username to, which is this username to lowercase test suite, and it is passing. We only have one it block, which is returns the lowercase of a valid user, and everything is passing. But let's check for our console.log. Perfect, guys, look at what happens here. So we have this first console.log, which is the setup, and remember we had before each and after each following each other. But from the console.log, you actually see that the setup runs first, followed by our main test, and then the teardown. Why do we need this setup? This setup is actually used to avoid repetition. It is used to improve our test quality and to help us write more dry code. Dry means do not repeat yourself. And also this teardown is used, maybe for instance we want to make some connection to a database. So we are going to see what this teardown is used for, maybe in a more advanced test. But for now, I just want you to get used to some Jest hooks and also when you can use them. So in this case, we can remove this after each, because for now it is not useful for us. All we need is this before each, because now I am not repeating myself. So if you look at the function, we also checked for error. How can we actually check for error? How can we test for error? So let's check how we can actually test for error. What happens when I have an invalid string? What should happen? So let's undo that case. So yet I'm going to write another it block, and here throws username, and here we pass our function as usual. And now actually check for exception, the function itself, the function that throws the error, must be wrapped within a function. This is very important, and you can also see this in the documentation. So let's go to the documentation. We have strings, we have arrays, we have exception. So here, if you want to test whether a particular function throws an error when it is called, you can use to throw, you can use to throw error. But the thing is, you can see the function, this, we have our expect, this particular function that actually throws the error, which is this function here, must be wrapped within a function. So let's see how we can actually achieve this. All right, so straight to our VS Code. Let's make this large. So we can simply say expect. Remember, it should be wrapped within a function. So expect our suit dot to lower. So now let's enter an empty string. Let's enter empty string and now dot to true. We can simply use to true. And let's see what happens. Fingers crossed. Perfect. Now it is passing, throws an error. We can also do this like this. So instead of, we can say expect. Let's look at another matcher. Expect suit dot to lower, passing an empty string. So an outside, we can say dot. We can also use to throw. So we have to throw, we also have to throw error. But if you are using dot to throw error, you should pass the error. All right, this is our test file, and our test file here, we can paste this and save. Let's see what happens. And it is passing. Let's also check another way we can test for exception. So instead of using the arrow function, there is another method. So let's copy this block and paste. And instead of using this, let's remove this. So here we are going to say, so let's define a function. And this function, let's call it undo exception or undo error. Okay. So inside this function, let's actually define our actual. Our actual is our suit dot. You can see the importance of this jest hook, because without this hook, we would have just been repeating ourselves more and more. So the hook is very important. So here, let's put this, and now we have this constant. The next thing we want to do now is so what we're actually doing here is wrapping this particular case, wrapping it in a function. And now let's see expect. We say expect, and we expect our undo error dot true. All right. Let's see if this works or not. And also it is passing. You see, this is the first one and this is the second one. All right, guys, I think we've seen a lot of jest matchers, but there is another thing I want us to talk about. Remember, I mentioned some properties the other time. I've used only. So, and I said when you use only, you can use only on this describe or it. So if you do dots, you see a lot of properties. You can use dots dot only on the describe function, and you can also use it on the it function. So here we also have dot only. What dot only does, we've seen it, we only run this particular block. So if you put only here, it runs this particular block. There is another property called skip. So if I put skip, it's going to skip this particular block. Let's see that in action. So npm test, and you see 3 skipped. So it's skipped this particular it 1, 2, 3, and that is why you get this 3 skip. So when you go back here, everything under user to lower test, which is this particular describe block, everything is skipped. Perfect. We also have another one, dot to do, and dot to do is used, for example, if inside this particular block I also want another it block, but I am not ready for now. Like I don't want to test it yet because I am still doing my implementation. So I can just say write what I want to do. So I can say password, and here I'm going to do put to do. Perfect. And let's save this. When you run this, let's see what happens. You see your to do, and when you move, okay, let me expand this. You see you have this, and then you have this particular marker for your to do. So this is very good when you have a lot of tests to do, and then there is a part of your test when you want to undo later. Instead of forgetting it, it is important to just use to do, to just like a reminder to remind yourself that you have to do this later. All right, guys, we've seen skip, we've seen only. So let's go back to where we used only the other time. Okay, we don't have only. So yeah, instead of using, let me go back to this it. Instead of using it dot only, I can also use fit. I am mentioning this because in some code base you might just see fit. This fit means it dot only. So and we also have sit, which is equivalent to it dot skip, but I think I prefer using my it, and if I need to skip, I can just specify it or run only or whatsoever. I prefer this way because it is more clear. For now, one more thing I want to talk about before we check another thing is here. Let's go back to this part. Let me ask a question. What happens if I am not just testing for 3 and 2? What if I want to also check for the product of a lot of stuffs? So for instance, I also want to check the product of 10 and 5. Am I going to do this manually? So we can also come here, copy this code and repeat ourselves. And I'm going to change this to, let's say, 10 and 5. And here, let me remove all this. And I want to say this should give me 50. So when you run this test, you have this. But this is repeating and repeating a whole lot. What if I want to run this also for 20 and 20? Will I keep doing this? So there is another thing we can do, which we can use .it.each, and this is what we call a parameterized test. So we can use it.each. Let me shift this block down. So it.each actually takes in an array, and this array, we take exactly what I want to pass. Like here, I am having 2 numbers. So here we are going to pass in our input and also the expected. So the input, the 2 numbers that I want to multiply, and also the result, the expected result. So here I'm going to pass, for instance, let's pass in 2 and 3, and the final result should be 6. I also want to check for 0 and 7, and the final result should be 0. I want to check for 10 and 10, and the final result should be 100. I want to check for 2 and 2, and the final result should be 4. Perfect. Now we have all this. Now how do we undo this? So these are what we want to check. These are our values and also the expected. Now let's do something. So if you look at this, we are getting some help. So this expects a string. So we have this first part. It expects a string and also a function, callback function. So here we can pass a string. So we can say should return the product of, now I'm going to use this symbol, and as, all right, now we need to pass a function, and this function we actually take, imagine we're also getting some help. So this function takes 3 arguments actually. The first one is a number, so it takes arguments of this form. So the first one is this number, the second one is this. So here we can just use maybe num1 or num2. I'm going to use A and B, and the third one is the expected. Expected. So guys, if you look at this is the expected value, and this is our A and our B. So the same thing we are doing here. So this is an arrow function, as we see. And now what we want to do, now we can actually say our const actual is equal to product, and in this product we need to pass just what, our A and B. Where is A and B coming from? It is coming from this place. Perfect. So now we can write our test. Very simple. Expect our actual dot to be, you can use to equal because we are testing for numbers. So to be and to equal, they are both equivalent. And here we can pass our expected. And where is this expected coming from? Here. So when you run this test, let's see what happens. And you see everything is passing. So let's check here. Should this particular line, okay, let's say test, just for us to be sure of what exactly we are getting. And let's run this test because we have a lot of test suites already. So here you see test, you see. So it's going to run it, how many times? It is going to run 4 times because we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see that this parameterization is very important, because instead of copying this code and repeating ourselves many times, we did it once. You can also do the same thing for string. So we can simply do this very fast. So here, let's just export a simple function, simply return our username dot to lowercase. Now let's see if I have this particular function, but I have a lot of people, a lot of users that are going to make use of my application. Am I going to check one after the other? No, we can also use this parameterized test, and here we are going to write, okay, we start by it.each, and remember each now takes in an array. So I will show you yet another way of doing this, and here I'm going to define my input, and my input should be the first thing I want to check. You see, the first case, let's say I want to check for the name Augustine, and I want this to be lowercase. So the expected, so it should be all lowered, Augustine. And also let's assume I have another user and her name is Beauty, should be simply a small form. The same thing we did the other time. So here, this is going to take now our description. So now our description, we can simply use input, because now I have this input to lowercase is or should be our expected. Let's see what happens here. And also this is expecting a function. Remember, just similar to what we did, but now here we passed in this object. So it's going to actually expect us, it's going to be expecting this particular something of this form. So an object of this form. So here I'm going to simply pass my input and I'm going to pass my expected. Perfect. So this is an arrow function. All right. So now we can actually write our test. So we can say const actual is equal to. So what is the name of our function? Let's go back and check. We called it username lowercase. Username lowercase. Perfect. And now we are going to pass just input, nothing else. And this input is this particular input here, which is what we passed. And now let's just write our test. Expect actual dot to be expected. And just as before, this expected is this. And also here, input to lowercase should be. So let's say here, let's put something so we can know where it's coming from parameterized testing. All right, let's run this and see what happens. Perfect. We have 18 cases and 1 to do, and everything is passing. And we can see this here. Augustine to lowercase should be Augustine. Beauty to lowercase should be this. From parameterized testing, this is this. So guys, I think this is actually a good point. In fact, this is a nice place to actually continue with unit testing. We've seen a lot of stuff. We've looked at Jest hook, which help us to write more dry code. Before we close this session, let's look at one more thing. What happens if I actually want to check my test coverage? So how do we actually check our test coverage to see what exactly we've done? So we can go back to our Jest config.ts, and in here we are going to add two important things. The first one, we are going to add collect coverage, and we are going to set this to true. And now we want to tell where the coverage should be coming from. So we can simply use collect coverage from, and here we are going to pass an array, but here we want to pass our root there, and here it should go to our src folder, and in our src folder it should go to our app, and in our app it should go to everything _ts. All right, so now we can run our test and see what happens. npm test. Perfect. And guys, we can see what happens just with these two lines. Now we have the coverage, we have everything. We can see the branch, we can see the functions that we tested. We can see that we tested all our lines of code. So what we did was to collect coverage from this particular file, and we see that we actually tested each block. We tested this function, we tested this, and that is why we are seeing 100 here. What happens if we go to our test, and instead of running everything, let's actually go to one of these block, describe, and let's skip this and see what happens. So let's save this and let's see what happens. So when you skip this, you see what happens. So we are just collecting coverage from 72.72 lines and the number of function, the branch. So let's see how we can actually understand this file better. When we ran this particular, when we added these 2 lines and we ran this, something happened when we did npm test. It added another folder to our project called coverage. And this folder actually should be node modules. And also let's add this coverage because we don't need to push it to GitHub. Yeah. So now let's look at this. Here we have this coverage and then we have our report. Let's go and open the report. In this report, we have this index.html page. Let's see what happens if we can actually run this particular page and see what happens. So we can open with HTML file. You can actually open this with your Chrome. So when we open this with our question, this is our index.html from the report. We see how it is. So the branches, if block in our code base, the functions are the functions we have in our code base. We have the lines. You can still expand this, and it's going to show you the functions that you tested. We also have one sys, which tells us the number of times these functions are being called, the number of times they are being called. And also another important part is this part with the red line, which tells us the ones we did not test. So remember, we skipped this particular part. Let's go back to our page. You can also open this page by coming to this go live. You click on go live and you should also have the same thing. All right, guys, let's go back. Let's close this particular file. Let's close this. We don't need it. And let's go back to our test. And let's remove this skip and see how the complete one looks on the page. npm test. Now we have this. Let's go back to this page. You see now everything is 100%. And when you open this, you don't see any red line again. Now guys, what happens if actually we don't want to run everything? If, for instance, does this mean we have to test everything in our file? We could have some functions that are so trivial that we don't have to actually test. So for Jest, you can actually type instantable ignore, and this will take you to this GitHub page. And this is telling us a lot of stuff, because this is telling us how to ignore code for coverage purposes. Like some part of my code that I don't want to cover, like that I don't want to see in my coverage report. We have some options. We can use instantable ignore and then specify the word or specify the part we want to skip. We can use ignore if for if block, but the important part is this part. So when you use instantable ignore next, it's going to ignore everything downward, like everything next. So let's go back to our code. Initially, when we, okay, Control Z, okay, here we put skip. So we are skipping this username to lowercase. Let's go back to, let's close this and go back here where we add our class. Let me put instantable.next and see what happens. Now you see that even when we skipped this particular block, we still have 100% coverage. So this is useful when you don't want to test some trivial parts and you just want to skip them. All right, there is one more thing we can actually look at, which is so simple and straightforward. Now, since we've been manually running our tests, and this sometimes is time consuming actually. So here we can actually add this watch. And what this will do is it will save us from manually rerunning this stuff all the time. So now when we just run npm test, alright, so now when we run npm test, we have this option, press A to run all tests if you want to run all tests. If you want to run only the failed tests, you have different options. So I'm going to use A and it's going to run all my tests. Now, for example, when I make a change, for instance here, let me remove this skip now and I save it. You see, it's going to run everything without me having to retype npm test. This is very useful. This and save it. And when you save it, you have this again. So one thing to mention, when you collect coverage, sometimes does not work very well with the watch. So you can just remove this watch and save your file. Okay, and now let's rerun npm test. So here I'm going to Control C. Let's rerun npm test, and now we have our coverage report. All right, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this course. Please do not forget to actually drop your comments on the comment section below. And also show some love by subscribing and also liking this course. Thank you once more and bye.